Yes, sir.
Yeah, you talked a year or two ago about representatives from a G8 country participating in a
CE5.
Yeah. Has there been any development with that?
Yeah, so he's asking about one of the G8 countries who very supportive of the CE5 initiative. And since it's been a couple of years, I'll talk about it very directly. The country is France. And so there was a president a couple years ago named Nicolas Sarkozy. And Sarkozy's people, his intelligence and Air Force people, who briefed him on all this stuff, were very, very interested in what we were doing. And one of the very old families in France that actually organized the beheading of Marie Antoinette, had this old estate in Brittany, and invited us there. So what we did a couple years ago, under the ruse of a training, just a weekend training, is that nobody who came knew this, except a couple of people. Well, of course, my wife knew. She knows everything. We had this thing, and of course I knew that it was going to be, we used this 2,200 acre estate. And there was an admiral there who's very high up. And also, this admiral had a PhD in physics. And is also, like myself, an MD. Very, very, very wonderful man. And a couple other people. And the host family, who, of course, was a very old French Foreign Legion diplomats, a family of very, very old French. And so we did this just as sort of a training, but also so that the government, the friendly people in the French government could learn the protocols and see. And so they were there. And then I heard back afterwards that they had the whole area, not cordoned off, but there was a security, observational security perimeter around it. And they tracked craft coming over at 200,000 kilometers an hour during the CE5. And it was just a group of novices. Most of them had never been out. And we had some amazing experience, including, if you've seen the photo, we were setting up one evening, and everyone on the side of the part of the circle where I was sitting, we saw this. I was just setting up to do this Sanskrit Vedic puja. And there was this, like a rainbow light that came in just in an instant. And so I had someone take a photograph, and there was this sort of royal purple, mauve-colored, fuzzy disc hovering right above the field. It's in this photograph, stunningly gorgeous. Not quite in this dimension, but not out of it either. But everyone looking in that direction saw this thing flash in. And then we were sitting there one night, and this object came over, and then we had all the cars. There were like 30 cars in this field, because we had like 60 people at this thing. And they all started turning their lights on and off. So this thing went over the vehicles, and it was like, this is like something out of a Close Encounters of the Third Kind movie. And of course, the admiral's going, holy shit, and and we're in deep meditation, and all of a sudden we hear this, right next to beyond where the cars were, this, it was almost like a metallic thing brushing up again. There was a craft that was quasi-materialized in the corner of the field. And later I went out, and there were these little beings, there were about 5 of them. And you could hear, now the problem is, everyone got up, and it scared the hell out of them. So you heard them scampering off. And so they scampered off and then dematerialized in thin air. Sort of like that one that was in the crop circle a couple years ago, where they saw the feet, and the police saw this tall, luminous white being that was fully materialized, and the police got out and chased it, and the footprint, and it just disappeared into the field in thin air. You know that case? Oh, I was right there when that happened. Yeah, it's near Silbury Hill. Anyway, these expeditions are awesome. You want to come on them, you should come. But the point is that, so they were very, very interested. Now, from there, in terms of bureaucracy, there, like in any government, there are people who are part of this MAGIC or Majesty group, Majestic, has different acronyms. Now it's called SIG, Senior Interagency Group, Intelligence Group. Some were friendly, some were not friendly. And when you're talking about a government moving off the dime on this openly, it's very difficult. But again, it's an iterative learning process. And so the way I view it is that, see one, do one, teach one. You demonstrate it, and then hopefully, and I know that they're learning, and probably they're practicing it. Now, the ethical construct and the philosophical underpinning of it is that it has to be done within the context of universal peace. It cannot be done within the context of one national entity vaulting itself over another, et cetera. But I know that this is not going to be able to be done through the UN, because we tried that. Back when Boutros Boutros-Ghali was UN Secretary General, and they were very interested. And his wife came to one of the salons I held in New York, and then the Secretary General after him, Kofi Annan, when we did Disclosure Project, originally they had committed to hold the Disclosure Project event at the Secretariat of the United Nations. But some folks came in with an all-access pass and essentially threatened to pull funding out of the UN on behalf of a certain number of countries, and it would destroy the UN. And I was called directly by an ambassador who is attached to the UN Secretary General saying, we wish you well, we support what you're doing, but we cannot do it at the UN. And that's why it was held here at the National Press Club. I have not told that story much. So, you look over the last 10, 15 years, there have been a lot of initiatives from the starts and stops from various governments. And so, yeah, there's a lot of interest, but it's sort of like, that old saying, everyone wants to be first to be second. No, there's a hesitancy to stick your neck out too far on something very controversial, as I mentioned earlier, but also on something that has not just a social opprobrium, but where there's some very powerful people who are not afraid of using their power in retribution against an entity that would do it. And this is why I tell people to me, the clearest path forward for contact, disclosure, and bringing these technologies out are the people, masses of people doing it. Large corporations, the very rich, governments, you don't want to be prejudicial against them, which is why I'm, like last year, I was happy to go to Australia and meet with all these folks. But you have limited expectations. You hope they do the right thing. But what I learned starting back in the Clinton years is that everyone wants to know about this stuff. Very few people want to do anything about it. So knowing about it and doing something about it are two totally separate things. And all we can do, I think each of us can do, is to provide the information, the knowledge, the vision, and let that gather amongst the populace and also with world leaders and other people and see where it goes. And I have a very, not detached, but a very realistic philosophy about that. And many people have said, well, when is disclosure going to happen? I said, well, we did it already. And people think I'm joking. I said, no, when we started this, only about a quarter or a third of the people thought this was real. Now it's 50-some%. Last year, the Marist poll said that 43% of Americans think that we're currently being visited by interstellar extraterrestrial beings. It's a huge number. So I say, in terms of the public, it's kind of there. In terms of officialdom and what I call the hidebound, inborn elite, the sort of inbred elite of the world, that's a harder thing to get through. And no smart part because of both power politics, but also more easily. As this one Air Force witness told me, he says, the real way this has been kept secret is just sheer ridicule. The subject, you really don't have to do or say anything. It hides itself because people don't want to be laughed at. People don't want to be put down by their peers. People don't want to be lose esteem. amongst their colleagues and what have you. So talk about courage. The biggest courage it takes for someone who's interested in this is to speak the truth in a way that is appropriate. You can't bring everything out to someone who doesn't know anything about it, but that's why we put Disclosure Project, the book, and the videos together, so that anyone who's even at the level of the most basic linear understanding will say, boy, where there's smoke, there's fire, because here's a lot of information from people who with sterling credentials. And, and there is this sort of strange hypocrisy with the mainstream media, and that is, if you had three people who would go on record with the New York Times or Washington Post about a senior person at the White House having sex with someone, it'd be all over. I have 110 people on videotape and testimony with corroborating documents, with their DD-214s, which is their discharge papers from the military, with signed statements, witness oaths that they would testify under oath before Congress with the penalties of perjury, federal penalties of perjury, and it gets ignored by all the mainstream media. You talk about a double standard. So this is, of course, what we're up against, because the big mainstream media, again, not so much, now some of them are tied into, quote, the cabal, if you want to call it that keeps it secret, but most of them, it's like this, I have a family member who will remain nameless, who used to be the city editor of the Boston Globe. And when she found out I was getting involved with this stuff, she says, I don't care if you put a dead extraterrestrial body on my desk, we're not going to run this story. We're a blue chip paper. That belongs in the National Enquirer, and it would never appear in the Boston. I mean, it was just like that. This is a family member. So, and this was not, I assure you, it's not someone on the payroll of the CIA, like Donald Menzel was, or Professor Condon. So I think that we have to understand that it is a real educational process, and putting together the Disclosure Project information with top secret documents and military witnesses and generals and ministers of defense and people who have credentials and respectability, as it were, as pilots or people who are at Strategic Air Command, that's very important. And that body of information is sitting there for anyone to take virtually for free. I mean, we have 60 some of these people's testimony up on the site on YouTube now for free. So that is important, that all of us should share that with folks. When you get to governments in these G8, it's very interesting. Before I went over there, I regret that this wasn't actually in the film Sirius. The director took it out, and I don't know why. But I have this beautiful letter, it's in French, from this admiral and the team who wrote about their commitment to make a long-term commitment for this journey with these visitors from other star systems. And amazing. And it's actually from the Ministry of Defense of France on their letterhead, signed. It is the most important government document in the history of the UFO subject, and there it sits in my vault. So what I say to folks is that that was just a few years ago, that process continues, but it's usually very quiet.
Why does SETI continue to be funded where you're clearly demonstrating like you can do all this with the protocol?
Right.
I mean, it's out there for people to just go and get the app
and do it. Well, yeah, it doesn't matter what kind of evidence you put together or even signals we get or images, the subject again gets debunked. But the other thing about the SETI project, like Seth Shostak and these people, they are carrying water for someone. Because you're either stupid or you're corrupt. There's two things to choose from here. If you really dug into this and you're at that level at NASA or the SETI project, and I debated Seth Shostak on Voice of America about this. I had my military witnesses, John Callahan, who had all the radar tapes, and we basically cleaned his clock. But at a certain point I said, you cannot look at all this dispositive evidence and proof and information and just dismiss it while you sit there and spend hundreds of millions of dollars saying you're listening from a signal from outer space, which, by the way, they've already received and been covered up. Now, I'm going to say something here because this is enough years after it happened. A few years ago, there was a show called Coast to Coast with Art Bell. And it was on the cover of Time magazine, and I was one of his favorite guests. And when I'd be on that show, it really lit things up at certain agencies. And one time I was on his show, and a few years back, towards the end of his career there, and this issue came up, and I said, well, you know, I have a source high up in SETI that confirms to me that they in fact have received interplanetary signals, but in a kind of phased, not normal array. It was kind of a pulsed array, and that it was kept secret and covered up. And the SETI people were furious. Subsequently, Seth Shostak got on the show and just said, well, Dr. Greer knew what he was talking about, and he probably talked to some volunteer computer operator, because we have all this network of volunteers. What Art Bell didn't know, and which Seth Shostak didn't know, and which I'm going to say now because it's enough water gone under the bridge, is that the guy who told me that was the founder of the SETI project and the Drake equation, Dr. Drake. He told me that they had that contact. Moreover, a man who had been one of Carl Sagan's best friends, the best man at his wedding, confirmed it. And he had been present when the WOW signal came in at Harvard. So, you know, it's very frustrating for me because, you know, these are people who, one of them was an astronomer who was actually at the Georgetown Westin Hotel in 1997 when we were doing briefings for Congress. But his presence there resulted in him being in contact, because he used to be the editor of Sky and Telescope magazine and Astronomy magazine, and had worked with Carl Sagan, all these people. And he said, he contacted my wife and me after that, and he says, you know, I've been told that if I don't back off of this, I will never have a working position again. And I got kids in college. So he, wonderful man, wished us all the best and left. So that's how it works. And, you know, I mean, I gave up my medical career. I mean, you know, people say, oh my God, you know, I say I gave up $500 and some thousand a year to be doing this for nada. But most people who are in a situation like that, who's an academic and what have you, unless they're independently wealthy, they really can't turn to the people who are hiring them as an editor or a professor and say, bug off. And so this brilliant scientist who had all this information, who started to come out, he never went public, but at the meeting with the members of Congress and these other initial witnesses we had in '97, when I was still trying to get the White House and Congress to do disclosure so I wouldn't have to do it in 2001, right before 9/11, he was at that meeting. But even being kind of out on this subject that much caused him to be contacted and be told, don't, stop it, or your career is over. He says, and it was made very clear to him, you will never work again. No one will hire you. So, you know, there are a lot of people like that. And so there is this, it's not so much some sort of Illuminati, it's this oppressive condemnation of the subject, along with abuse of power, you know. I mean, it's quite illegal for the CIA to be infiltrating an alleged independent Air Force investigation at the University of Colorado and put someone on their payroll to prejudice the jury and kill the report on this subject in 1969, whenever that happened, when the CIA is barred from having any domestic activities. I mean, this is illegal. Go read the law. And it's also, however, why I've told people this is why everything we're doing is legal. Very different from, say, Edward Snowden, who was disclosing information that the president knew about and certain members of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence knew about and the House Intelligence Committee knew about. The stuff I'm disclosing are things that the president is being lied to, the head of Intelligence Joint Staff who I briefed, Admiral Wilson, was lied to, the head of the Defense Intelligence Agency was lied to, a sitting CIA director was lied to, chairmen of key committees that I met with, senators and House, were lied to. I can prove that in a court of law. A priori, those projects are illegal, and I have declared them rogue and illegal, and therefore they cannot touch us. And that's the difference. I want to make this a very clear point. There's a big difference between disclosing something that's being kept secret, even if it's wrong. I'm not saying that what Snowden disclosed was right or wrong. He probably did a service in the long run. But that was being overseen by the appropriate governmental elected and appointed officials. And something like this that has no constitutional oversight and is a complete criminal operation and rogue. That, and this is why, Danny Sheehan, who worked with me right before Disclosure Project, he and I discussed this. He's a constitutional attorney who did the Silkwood case and the Pentagon Papers representing the New York Times. And he said, look, given the people you've met with and the fact that they've been denied access, who are at the top of the heap, not only in the United States, but people like that I've met with in Great Britain, France, other places where they're completely being left out, that is prima facie evidence of an illegal operation. And therefore, if it's an illegal operation, they can't cite the rule of law to protect themselves, which is why our position was in the late 90s, early 2000s, anyone with documents, information, whatever about this, you can come forward without any penalty of violating your national security oath. Now, saying it and having people do it because they're afraid. People have been threatened with death, but we did get enough people to come forward because we had a critical mass. I didn't come forward with one or two, I came forward with dozens, all at once. So that was the power of unity and the power of doing it. We really need to have another wave of that happen from people who are currently in government, and not just retired people. But the closer someone is to central operations at Lockheed Skunk Works or the agency or the NSA who know about this, and the closer in time they're related to it, the more afraid they are of TWEEP, terminate with extreme prejudice, which is the euphemism for what this guy at the CIA has told me. They call it wet works, wet meaning blood, wet works, TWEEP. So, yeah, nice. Well, welcome to my world. I live and breathe. And that's why a lot of these people are very afraid if they're really currently in current operations. It's not that they don't understand the legal principle I just articulated. In other countries, it's a minor version of the same thing. So say in France, you have friendly people, just like there are here, very interested in actually trying to do something, but then there'll be others who are in a compartmented operation tied into this international group that maintains secrecy, and at a certain point they will be threatened. And that's what happened. We actually had, I was contacted by these people in France and said, an official in the United States contacted the ambassador from France to the United States and said, what the hell do you think you're doing? After I got this document from the Ministry of Defense and this big outline of all the studies they wanted to do post-contact, biological, technological, the whole bit. It's this amazing document I have. And it's like, curl your hair. What little hair I have left would be curled. But when I read it, I went, wow, I can't believe I got this from a sitting government. But they got contacted, and basically they came to some kind of a truce where they said, well, you can do this with Dr. Greer so long as you stay on French soil. Do not try to do it anywhere else. They said, fine, fine, fine. So that's why we did it there.